and your father?
Okay. My name is Marianne Bowling, and I am the daughter of Earl Clyde Acuff, who is my father, and I'm one of 8 children. I'm the second to the oldest and the oldest daughter. Let's see, what else do I need to? What else do you need to know?
So you are the second of the 8 children.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And she's the youngest.
She's the youngest daughter. I had a brother who was 2 years younger than her, and he has passed away. But the rest of us are still around. I just turned 76, so we're all getting older. But all of us are about 2 years apart. Just about.
Okay.
So little stair steps.
When did your father pass away?
In 2013.
2013, huh?
In February.
Okay. So how long your father has been at Virginia Tech as a commander?
He retired from the Army in 1974, I think was his official papers. He was in the regular Army. He retired as a full colonel. And then I think that same year, Dr. Hahn at Virginia Tech asked him, he was the professor of military science there. Dr. Hahn asked him if he would come back as the Commandant of the Corps. And you know, gave it some thought. I think my mother was a little iffy about whether she wanted him to still work, but he had built a house down in Luster's Gate, and he had a small farm, and he had some cows, and he just liked doing that. But you know, that was at the time during the Vietnam War. He had been in Vietnam in 1967 and 68 for 15 months. He worked for General Rawson, but then the main job he had there, he was the brigade commander of the 3rd Brigade in the 1st Infantry Division. And he did that until he left Vietnam and came back, and then he taught at the infantry school in Fort Benning, which is now Fort Moore in Georgia. And then he came to Virginia Tech as a professor of military science. And so after he became Commandant of the Corps, and the reason he did that was because during the Vietnam era, the Corps became very unpopular. And I think the Board of Visitors even considered maybe getting rid of the Corps. The number of people in the Corps had really dropped to a really low level. I'm not sure what the number was, but so my dad looked at that as a challenge. He loved the Corps, he loved the Army, just felt like it was a real mission for him, I think. And so he went back to Tech as the Commandant, and he went out recruiting and built the Corps back up. So I think in a way he probably saved it at that time. But it was there was a lot going on, even on campus.
So that was 1970?
It would have been around 74, 75. Yes.
Okay.
He was, like I say, he was in Vietnam in 67, 68. I was in college I graduated in 71 from the University of Maryland. And I can remember, because when you'd go to class, there would be tear gas all over. Lots of people were demonstrating there in the DC area, and they all came to the university campus. It was a mess. You were just glad to get back to where you didn't have to be on campus.
In 1970.
And that was in 71.
Wow.
Yeah. And I can remember coming home during that year, and my dad was at Benning then, teaching, and talking to him about the war. And, he just, in the military, you do what you're told to do, basically. It was interesting. We saw some film of my dad in the National Archives, where they had pulled some people out of one of these tunnels, and they were young men. They were Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. They were young men, and they were both wounded. And so my dad had a translator, of course, you know, and he was trying to ask them, you know, some questions and things. They wanted to try to get some information from them. And these two young men were sitting on the ground, and my dad was sitting there with them, and he had called the medics over.
So you watched the movie,
Yes,
film?
yes, it's in the National Archives. You couldn't watch it.
Okay. I heard Daddy was also in the History Channel too.
Yes, yes, he was. They did a thing in the History Channel. He also there's a museum in Anchorage, Alaska, you know, where he spent many years. He lived in Alaska for 7 years.
Yeah, Alaska, some kind of like he was the only person. Did what I heard.
He was in the Alaskan Scouts.
The last scout.
Alaskan Scouts. And what it was a bunch of native Alaskans and miners, people who lived in Alaska. In World War II, they recruited those people to do
the map.
Reconnaissance. Yes, they did map the whole western coast of Alaska, but that was after the war. During the war, those Alaskan Scouts, that unit, it was kind of like guerrilla warfare. They didn't really function with the regular army, but they sent them out on the Aleutian Islands to look for incoming Japanese airplanes and, you know, to try to gather intelligence. And they lived out there just sort of on their own, you know. They'd send a few of them out there. And the funny story is one that it's, you know, you can read about it. It's in several books of people who've written about the Scouts. But they put him out on this island in the Aleutians. And the Aleutians
cannot contact any people else.
Yeah, do not contact
isolated,
any people.
totally
Yes.
isolated. Yeah.
Right, and they said don't break, you know, don't break radio contact here because we don't want anyone to know that you're there. So I guess he stayed there for quite a while, and they thought that he and the couple men he was with were dead. So they
How
sent
about the food? Do you know where did they get his?
How they got their food? They shot. Is it ptarmigan? There's some kind of a flying ptarmigan. Yeah, they shot those, and they also fished, and they dived for crab. They ate very well. They did not go hungry, but they just, you know, lived off the land there. And you know, the Aleutian Islands are barren. They're just the most. If you've ever seen pictures of them, they're just the most windblown, cold, awful places. I can't imagine being there. But anyway, so they sent a boat out to get them, you know, pick up their bodies, basically, if they could find them. And when the boat came up there, these guys and my dad came running down the hill, you know, and they were like, "You're alive?" You know?
How many people?
Yeah, and I don't know how many there were there, but anyway.
How long? For how long they have been there?
How long? I think they were there for probably at least, would you say, a couple months? I don't know. I don't know.
And the government thought they already died. They didn't
Yes.
contact them.
No, they did not. And they said, "Why didn't you, you know, contact us?" And he said, "We weren't supposed to. You told us not to, you know." So that's why they didn't.
Oh
But
my
the
goodness.
people who came to get them were so impressed with the good food that they were eating. They had all this crab and everything, and they were eating probably K rations or something. And they said, "Oh, well, before we go back, you know, do you have any crab, you know, or some of this stuff?" And my dad goes, "Well, no, we're kind of low on supplies." He said, "But get in the boat and come on out here. I'll dive down and get some." And he just, they said the water was clear. He could look down and they could see him down there, and he'd go down and pick up these big crabs and bring them up, and the water was cold. And then they said, "Well, jump in the boat and let's get back to shore." And he goes, "No, I'll push you." So he swam behind the boat, pushing it, and the guy in the boat was, you know, rowing. I think every time I read that story and I hear things about stuff my dad did. You know, when they mapped
Yeah, how did
the
he got
coast
the map?
on dog sleds.
Mm-hmm.
They mapped it during the winter on dog sleds because when it's not wintertime, the surface of the land is mushy. You know, it's what do they call that, muskeg? I can't remember. I don't know. I was born in Alaska.
Oh, really?
Yes, but I don't. I was so tiny when we left there.
Of course.
You know, yeah. That I don't know anything about it. I traveled there once, but I did not even go to Anchorage, where I was born at Fort Richardson, which is right outside of Anchorage. But anyway, he homesteaded on a little piece of land down on the Anchor River, and he, my sister, one of my sisters, she lived up there for, I'm going to say, about 10 years.
Really?
In that cabin. It was a cabin.
Really?
Didn't have running water. 10 years.
Wow.
17 years? 17 years. Oh, wow. Yeah. So, you know, I don't know how she did that. They had an outhouse. She had 2 babies while she lived there. And it was kind of isolated.
Yeah.
It wasn't around other people. But I was just going to say, with regard to my father,
your father very strong, and he had been
Very strong.
champion for different
yes.
the boxing. He was
Yes.
boxing also the
golden gloves.
gold gloves and whatever. It's just, he got 20 champions after even he became the commander of WWII for the which sports?
Racquetball.
Racquetball,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
The nationally, internationally, right?
Yes, he was in the, you know, he played in the amateur part of that. He wasn't a professional, but he just did that as a sideline. He played handball most of his life, you know, when he worked at the Pentagon, because
So how long he worked at the Pentagon?
Oh my goodness. Okay, he worked there for 3 years when I was in grade school. And then he was at the Pentagon, I think, for a short time in the mid-60s. But then he went to GW, George Washington
University,
and got his master's in international...
1967.
About...
I read the paper.
I can't remember the date, but I do remember that he worked with the State Department after that on Central and South American affairs because security, he traveled a lot to Central America. I remember that.
Oh, for what?
Because he worked with the State Department. They were working on security, and you know, he worked with several of the Central American countries, and he spoke Spanish. You know, I don't know how good his Spanish was, but I do remember, yeah, he did. Anyway, he worked for the State Department for a year or 2 after he got his master's when he was at the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania.
Before that, how old at that time? He was already around 50.
How old was he?
I think he also was the oldest one.
Yes.
Teach his parasites.
Okay.
Right?
He was a paratrooper from the time he was a young soldier. But when he was 47 years old, he was at Fort Benning. He was, I think he was teaching at that time.
Yeah, he was teaching those people.
And they wanted to see if someone who was a field grade officer could go through the ranger training. They didn't know if it was too hard. He was the oldest person who ever went through and passed the ranger training. So yeah, that would have been in probably, I remember where we lived at that time. It was on Lumpkin Road on Fort Benning. So I would have been in 10th grade. That would have been in about 1965. And I remember when he came back from there, from the ranger training and passed, a lot of the guys that went to ranger training were very young. You know, they were very young.
Yeah. He was 47.
He was 47, yes. And he was already a full colonel then. Anyway, when he came back, he invited a lot of the guys that were in Ranger training with him to come over to the house for a barbecue. My dad loved to entertain people. I don't know if my mother loved it because she did all the work, but he was always inviting people over. You know, he always liked to have people there. But anyway, so all these young guys came over, and they were outside. And I always used to help my mom, you know, just like doing dishes and things in the kitchen, you know. And I remember standing out there talking to a couple of these guys, and I would have been in high school then, and they were like, "I can't believe your dad. He's just amazing." He would, you know, when we were falling back, he'd go, "Come on, you guys, you know, what's wrong with you?"
Still young.
And he'd help them, you know. And they said he outdid us on almost everything.
So your father's health, like is like a superhuman being.
Absolutely. You know, I think about it. For how many people can dive in really cold water? That water would have been very cold, you know, where the Aleutian Islands are, and hold your breath for that long. Yeah, he's pretty amazing. I'm just reading a book right now. It's called Why We Swim, and I can't remember the lady that wrote it, but it's a well-known book. And she's talking about people who are actually like human seals that survive these long, you know, like their boat, you know, wrecks, and they swim 3 miles in 47-degree water, and they survive it, you know. And I don't know how, but my dad, he was physically pretty amazing.
Yeah, I noticed those people who like physically very strong, very healthy person, their career also very good. Because if very successfully, you know, people in the careers, they need the physical body very healthy to support them. Your father is a very good example.
Yeah.
And
and you know, in his mind, like I remember when he was old, when he was like in his 90s, I was talking to him one day because
how old when he was passed away?
94.
94. Okay, yes.
When he lived here at Warm Hearth, he lived at Warm Hearth for about 5 years, I think, maybe 6. Anyway, on the weekends, I lived in Parisburg, which is, you know, about 25 miles from here. But I worked all the time. I worked about 10 hours a day. I mean, I didn't have time to take care of and so he stayed at Warm Hearth during the week, and then on the weekends, I would go get him, and he would spend the weekends with us. And so I got a lot of chances to talk to him. Actually, he disliked hanging out with my husband. They like to watch sports and stuff. So, but you know, I was just talking to him one day, and I asked him, because you know, everything he ever did, he excelled at. He was president of his fraternity. He was captain of the football team.
Oh, he also captain of football team.
He had a football scholarship in college. He was in a pre-med program when he went to the University of Idaho, where he met my mother. And anyway, he you know, had to spend a lot of time in class and in clinic, but he was on a football scholarship, and his coach was I guess giving him a lecture on why he wasn't at practice, or you know. And my dad said, "Well, I can't, you know, I have to be in clinic and such." And he said, "No," he goes, "you don't need to be a doctor. You're too mean." He goes, you know. And so
we have another daughter here.
My dad actually gave up that, you know, that major, and he ended up, I think, being a physical education major. But he was in ROTC too. That was before World War II. And you know, when he got out of when he graduated from college, he said, "I know, you know, there's going to be a war, and so I'm gonna choose what I want to do. I'm going to join the military." And then, you know, he joined the Army. But
I think this is the right decision.
Yes, it was right for him. I think I don't know, he's funny, you know, but no matter what he did, he always excelled. He couldn't, I think he could never accept the fact that he was mortal, you know. And I remember talking to him, I had this conversation with him. I said, "You know, Dad, how would it, can you imagine what it would feel like to be just like a regular person? I said, like me. I said, I never really did anything special or excelled in anything, you know. I was never an exceptional anything. I said, could you imagine what it'd be like to just be an average person? And my dad looked at me like, no, I can't imagine what that would be like. He had the funniest look on his face. He was just like, no, you know.
So could you tell more stories or maybe things about he was like the commander of like a Virginia Tech cadet? So any stories about that?
You know, I don't know a lot of stories about that. I will say one thing. When my dad passed away, I got a letter from a man who was a congressman. His name was Ron, I want to say Whitman. I'd have to look that up. I don't even know if he's still in Congress now. But anyway, at the time, this would have been 2013, he wrote the nicest letter, and he said that, you know, he was in the Corps at Tech, and he was on the Armed Services Committee in Congress, and he said, I can't tell you how many, in fact, I still have that letter. I know exactly where it is. He said, I can't tell you how many times when I've thought about decisions I had to make on this committee that I've remembered the very words that your father said, you know.
Okay.
So I thought that was interesting. And another thing I will say, this is a story, this is funny. My youngest son is an accountant. He works in Roanoke, and of course there are a lot of tech graduates around here. And my son was telling me, this was maybe a year or so ago, he had this client, you know, it was during tax season, he was doing taxes. He had this client that came in, and his wife was with him. And, you know, no one likes to hear that they have to pay taxes.
Of course not.
And so he was explaining, you know, his return and some different issues. And he said his wife was sitting there. She was just like, and my son said, you could tell she just wasn't real happy. He said, but you know, this is my job. I've got to tell you the way it is. And so my son said to the man, he said, oh, you know, I noticed that you were in the Corps. And the guy was probably about my age. And he said, my dad was the commandant there. And my grandfather, is what he said, my mother's father. And the guy said, well, what was his name? And my son said, it was General Acuff. And this guy's wife jumps up and she goes, oh my goodness, we love General Acuff. He was so good. And my son was kind of surprised because she didn't seem like a very friendly person, you know. But both of them told him the story of this kid, when he was a kid, he was young, was graduating from the Corps, and they had given him an assignment, you know, he joined the Army, given him an assignment, but it wasn't anything that he wanted to do. And I can't remember what it was. I don't even remember what, you know, if it was an engineer or whatever. Anyway, so my dad had to go up to the Pentagon for something, you know, because he did a lot of other things, you know, with other military, and they had some association there. So he was at the Pentagon, and I guess he talked to someone who actually did those kind of assignments. And he called this kid from DC, and he said, I've got some good news for you. I got you transferred into this. And this guy said, it made the difference in my entire career in the Army. He said, I have always been grateful to him. And he said, I was just some lowly cadet. I didn't even know he really knew me.
Your father have a good heart.
Oh, my dad had a good heart. He really did. I think, you know, when he was in different places in his career, that his soldiers really loved him. And my dad always said, you know, we never, ever left anybody, you know, whether they were dead or alive. He
Good.
said that always
Good.
brought them home with us.
You always take care of the others.
Yes, and you know, another story, this wasn't at Tech,
Mm-hmm.
but this was during the Korean War. And the only reason I knew this is because, do you remember Governor Wilder? He
Yeah, the
was
movie.
he was the, I think, the only black governor of Virginia. And this would have been back in, I don't know when that was. I lived in Pearisburg at that time.
I have a picture with the governor at Virginia.
Oh, really? Well, Governor Wilder, you know, was in Korea during the time my dad was there. And apparently he was under, you know, my dad, I think, was a company commander in Korea. Well, anyway, Governor...
2 years in Korea?
Yeah, I think it's 15 or 18 months they spent.
Oh, okay.
And actually, he was at Pork Chop Hill. There's a book written about Pork Chop Hill that mentions him. But my dad did tell some stories about that. That was pretty bad. He said Korea was so horrible because the artillery there was just unbelievable. But this story that Governor Wilder wrote an autobiography, and in that book, he wrote about my dad. And, you know, at that time, black soldiers were not being, you know, they were not being promoted. They weren't being...
Bass.
Yeah, no, they were just being passed over. They weren't being treated right. And so the other black soldiers in Governor Wilder's unit talked to Governor Wilder. And I guess he was always sort of an organizer, you know, obviously, and a leader. He turned out to be, for sure, but even back in those days. And so he went and talked to my dad. And Governor Wilder said, you know, that my dad listened to him, and he said after that, things changed. And so I thought that was a really nice, you know, a really good thing.
I'm starting to love your father.
Yes, I know.
From a stranger.
When we were kids, we were always
love
like,
him.
oh no, Dad, you know, he's always saying this, and we just, you know, kind of laugh about it. But I don't think I really realized the person my dad was. He was, you know, he had so much courage. Not saying he wasn't afraid. I'm sure he was a lot of times, because, you know, he'd tell you that. But it was always, and he always put other people in front of him. You know, when he was a kid, he grew up in Des Moines, went to high school there. And at the time, you know, and he always talked about, you know, the black kids, and, you know, then they had the Italians, and then they had the Jewish kids, and then, you know, then him. And he was funny. He said, you know, all the kids liked me. And I said, why? And he goes, because he knew that I could whip anybody and I'd take care of them. And, you know, he was just this person who, I don't know, maybe had a paternalistic sort of, you know, thing. He knew he could take care of people, and he did. He told a story once about when his mother died when he was about 3 or 4. He was little, and he had a little sister. There were, I think, 6 of them in their family. And when he was, this was when he was little, after his mother died, the kids all got farmed out to aunts and uncles. But he had an older sister who didn't really approve of that. So when she was about 16, I think, she got married and took all the other kids into her house and pretty much raised them. And his dad was there. His dad was a miner, so they were very poor, you know. And so one day, I guess there was this kid, a friend of my dad's, that was over at their house. And he was a black kid. And when he left, my aunt said, Earl, I don't want you bringing him over here again. And he said, why? And she said, well, because, you know, he might steal some stuff here from us, you know. And my dad said, I just told my sister, what? We're poorer than he is. There's nothing here to steal. But he was always just, you know, he appreciated people for who they were, And one thing he always told us, he couldn't stand a liar, a cheat, or a thief. And I'll tell you what, when you were, if nothing else you ever did, you better tell the truth. If he asked you about something, I remember in my own, when I was little, I was probably in kindergarten. I still remember this. We lived in this big old army quarters. I slid down the banister one day, because we used to do that. And at the bottom of the banister of the stairs, there was a big post. And he had it was some kind of was a guy, a statue, a little statue thing. It was something he'd won for doing something. And sitting there, and I ran into it, knocked it off, and broke it off. But I was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. So I put it back up there. Well, my dad saw that it was broken, so he called all of us kids in there. And there were, at that time, probably 4 of us. And then I had a little tiny sister, my sister Jana. She was just a baby. But the other 4 of us were there. And he said, okay, who did this? And nobody said anything. We were all afraid. And so I think because one of my sisters looked guilty, he said that she did it, and he was going to punish her,
You pretend very well.
And I was like, oh, and so I said, because it was my sister Artis, and I was like, oh, Dad, I did it. I slid down the banister and I hit that. And my dad, I thought I was just cooked right there. And he goes, well, he said, I'm glad you told the truth. He said, that's really important. I'm not going to punish you. I'm sorry you did it, but, telling the truth is always the best way to go. I still remember that. It's just
great lesson for you.
in my brain. Yeah, those are the stories that I remember about.
Great.
He was always fair.
Let me see if they have any questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So far. Yeah. Hi. Any questions? So we can have questions. So now I think we have no more. No questions. So that's fine. That we don't have. I guess people just enjoy and listen to the story, huh?
I must have covered it all. His stories, his life is vast.
I have another patient. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
I talk to other people for 5 minutes. Maybe 5 minutes. I'll be right back. You can talk to.
Oh no, I don't know what to say. I wouldn't know.
Okay, then maybe we can stop here. Yeah. Maybe we can continue next time if you want.
Okay. I don't know what else to tell though. I don't know. If you want some more stories, I do have another sister who really is, she knows different stories about them.
Oh, this is wonderful. It's already wonderful. Yeah. Great. Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, thank you. Thank you too. We have someone here. Another sister. Her younger sister.
My much younger sister.
So how can I'm not sure how can I stop here.